The morning fog clung to the James River like the breath of the dead when Thomas Whitmore first set foot on Ashford land. His leather boots sank into soil that felt wrong beneath his feet, too soft, too yielding, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow his steps whole. Thomas had surveyed dozens of plantations across Virginia, but none had made his stomach turn the way Ashford Grove did before he even reached the main house. The assignment seemed simple enough: map the boundaries of the vast Ashford estate for the Commonwealth Land Registry. But as he unpacked his surveying equipment that October morning in 1858, the whispers began. At first he thought it was wind through the tobacco fields, but the air was still dead still in a way that made his skin crawl. The whispers came from underground. Soft voices speaking words he couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, frightened voices that seemed to rise from the very soil beneath his feet. Thomas tried to focus on his work, but every time he drove a stake into the ground, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if he was disturbing something that should have been left alone. By noon he had covered only a fraction of the property, but already his hands were shaking as he made notes in his leather-bound journal. The main house loomed before him, a magnificent three-story mansion with white columns that gleamed in the pale sunlight. But there was something wrong with its perfection. Every window was dark despite the daylight, and no smoke rose from any of the chimneys. Though October in Virginia was cold enough to warrant fires, Thomas approached the front door with growing unease, each step echoing strangely as if the ground beneath the circular drive was hollow. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing a woman so pale she seemed carved from marble. Catherine Ashford stood 6 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes the color of winter ice. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never known physical labor, but there was something predatory in the way she watched him. "Welcome, Mr. Whitmore," she said in a voice like silk over steel. "I trust you will find our property most interesting." Thomas removed his hat, trying to shake off the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The whispers had stopped the moment she appeared, but somehow their absence was more unsettling than their presence. "Mrs. Ashford," he began, but she cut him off with a gesture. "Miss Ashford," she corrected. "My brother Cornelius handles all business matters, but he is indisposed today. Perhaps you would join me for refreshment before you continue your work." Something in her tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. The interior of the house was as magnificent as the exterior. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. But Thomas noticed that every mirror in the house was covered with black cloth, and the air inside felt thick and oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Catherine led him to a sitting room where afternoon tea was already prepared, though he hadn't seen any servants. She poured from an ornate silver service, her movements precise and deliberate. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, what brings the Commonwealth to survey our land after all these years?" Thomas accepted the delicate china cup, though his hands were still trembling slightly. "Routine documentation, Miss Ashford. The state requires updated maps of all properties over a certain size." Catherine smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "How thorough. I do hope you won't find the work too disturbing. Many men have found our soil somewhat unforgiving." The tea tasted of herbs he couldn't identify, with an underlying bitterness that made him want to spit it out. But politeness kept him drinking, as the liquid warmed his stomach. The whispers returned, but now they seemed to be coming from inside his own head. Men, women, children, all speaking at once in voices filled with such anguish that Thomas gripped his teacup to keep from crying out. Catherine watched him with those ice-cold eyes, as if she could see exactly what was happening to him. "The Ashford fortune began with my great-grandfather," she said conversationally. "He understood that true wealth requires sacrifice. Most people are too squeamish to make the necessary choices, but our family has never suffered from such weakness." Thomas tried to respond, but found his tongue thick and clumsy. The room began to spin slightly, and those terrible voices in his head grew louder, more insistent. "You should rest," Catherine continued. "The work can wait until tomorrow. We have prepared a room for you." She rang a small silver bell, and a young woman appeared, so quietly Thomas hadn't heard her approach. "This is Patience. She will show you to your quarters." The girl couldn't have been more than 16, with hollow cheeks and eyes that held the flat despair of someone who had given up hope long ago. She curtsied, without speaking, and gestured toward the stairs. Thomas wanted to refuse, wanted to flee this house and never return, but his legs felt like water and his vision was growing dim around the edges. Whatever had been in that tea was taking hold fast as Patience led him upstairs. He caught glimpses of other rooms through partially open doors. In one, a massive dining table was set for dozens of guests, but every plate was cracked, and every glass was filled with what looked like dark soil. In another, he saw a library where the books lay open, but their pages were blank white as bone. At the end of a long hallway, Patience opened a door to reveal a bedroom that might have been luxurious once, but now felt like a tomb. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, and the air smelled of decay beneath layers of lavender and rosewater. "Sleep well, Sir," Patience whispered, "and whatever you hear tonight, don't leave this room." Her warning sent ice through his veins. But before he could ask what she meant, the girl had vanished back down the hallway, silent as a ghost. Thomas collapsed onto the bed, still fully clothed, as the drug in the tea finally overwhelmed him. In his last moments of consciousness, he heard the whispers again, clearer now and filled with desperate urgency. They were trying to warn him, but warn him of what? Thomas awoke to absolute darkness and the sound of digging. His head pounded from whatever Catherine had put in his tea, but the rhythmic scraping of shovels cutting through earth was unmistakable. He fumbled for his pocket watch. 3:15 in the morning. The digging sounds came from directly beneath his room, steady and methodical, as if whoever was working had done this many times before. Against Patience's warning, Thomas crept to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. Moonlight revealed the side yard where dozens of figures moved like shadows across the lawn. Men, women, and children, all carrying shovels or dragging bundles wrapped in canvas. They worked in complete silence except for the sound of their tools biting into the soft Virginia soil. Thomas counted at least 20 people, but in the shifting moonlight it was hard to be certain. What chilled him most was how they moved, with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes, as if something else was pulling their strings. One of the figures looked up toward his window, and Thomas jerked back from the curtain, but not before he saw the face, pale as bone with empty black sockets, where eyes should have been. His rational mind insisted he was still drugged, still seeing things, but his surveyor's training had taught him to trust his observations. Something terrible was happening on Ashford land, and had been happening for a very long time. The digging continued until just before dawn. Thomas dozed fitfully and woke to find bright sunlight streaming through his window. The side yard showed no sign of the previous night's activity. The grass was undisturbed, and there was no evidence that anyone had been digging anywhere. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Patience entered, carrying a breakfast tray, her movements as silent as before. She set the food on a small table and turned to leave, but Thomas caught her arm. The girl flinched as if he had struck her. "Wait," he said gently. "What happened here last night? I heard digging, saw people in the yard." Patience shook her head violently, eyes wide with terror. "You must have been dreaming, sir. Nothing happens here at night. Nothing at all." But her voice shook as she spoke, and Thomas noticed fresh dirt under her fingernails. "Please," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "Just do your work and leave. Don't ask questions. Don't go where you're not supposed to. And whatever you do, don't go near the old cemetery." Then she was gone, leaving Thomas alone with his breakfast and a growing certainty that he had stumbled into something far worse than a simple surveying job. The food looked appetizing enough: bacon, eggs, fresh bread, and jam. But Thomas couldn't bring himself to eat. If Catherine had drugged his tea, what might she do to his breakfast? Instead, he dressed quickly and gathered his equipment. The morning air outside felt clean and normal after the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Thomas tried to focus on his work, but the events of the previous night had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He began mapping the eastern boundary of the property, using his surveying instruments to measure distances and angles. The work was familiar, comforting in its precision and objectivity. But every time he drove a surveying stake into the ground, the whispers returned, faint at first but growing stronger as he worked his way deeper into the estate. The voices seemed to be calling to him, pleading with him, though he still couldn't make out the words. By midday he had covered several acres and his map was taking shape. The Ashford property was even larger than he had initially thought, stretching from the James River inland for several miles. Most of it was planted in tobacco, but there were also fields of corn and cotton, all tended by slaves who watched him with wary, suspicious eyes. Thomas tried to speak with some of the field hands, but they either ignored him completely or hurried away as if afraid to be seen, talking to him. The few who did acknowledge his presence did so with a mixture of fear and pity that made his skin crawl. Late in the afternoon, he came to a section of the property that his map showed as cleared land. But when he arrived, he found himself at the edge of a dense forest. Ancient oaks and maples towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the sunlight. The air beneath the canopy felt cold and still, as if no wind had stirred these woods in years. Thomas consulted his compass and his notes. According to his measurements, this forest shouldn't exist, but there it was, dark and forbidding like something from a fairy tale. He was about to turn back when he noticed a narrow path winding between the trees. The path was well worn, as if many feet had traveled this way over many years. Against his better judgment, Thomas followed it. The deeper he went into the woods, the stronger the whispers became. Now he could make out individual voices, men, women, children, all speaking in the desperate tones of people who had suffered greatly. The path curved and twisted, seeming to lead him in circles, but always drawing him deeper into the forest. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Thomas emerged into a clearing. What he saw there made his blood freeze in his veins. Dozens of graves stretched across the clearing. But these weren't the neat marked headstones of a proper cemetery. These were crude mounds of earth topped with rough wooden crosses or simple stones. Some of the graves were so old that grass and weeds had grown over them. Others looked freshly dug, the earth still dark and loose. Thomas counted them carefully using his surveyor's precision. 91 graves, 91 unmarked resting places hidden away in this forgotten corner of the Ashford estate. As he stood there trying to process what he was seeing, the whispers grew so loud they seemed to shake the very air around him, and for the first time he could understand what they were saying. Help us, remember us, don't let them bury the truth. Thomas fled the hidden cemetery, but the voices followed him, even as he ran through the darkening forest, stumbling over roots and branches. The whispers of the dead pursued him like a tide of anguish. By the time he reached the main house, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his hands shook as he tried to steady himself. Catherine waited on the front porch, as if she had known exactly when he would return. Her pale eyes studied him with something that might have been amusement. "You look disturbed, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Perhaps the afternoon heat was too much for you." Thomas wanted to confront her about the graves, but something in her expression warned him to be careful. "Just tired," he managed. "It's been a long day," Catherine smiled, that cold, empty smile. "Indeed, Cornelius has returned from his business in Richmond. He's quite eager to meet our surveyor." She led him inside to a study lined with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Behind the desk sat a man who could have been Catherine's twin, tall, pale, and sharp-featured with the same ice-blue eyes. But where Catherine moved with predatory grace, Cornelius radiated raw menace. His very presence made the air in the room feel thick and poisonous. "Whitmore," Cornelius said without rising, "I trust Catherine has been taking good care of you." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. Cornelius opened a ledger book on his desk, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers. "We are a business family. Mr. Whitmore, everything we do serves the greater prosperity of the Ashford name. Some might question our methods, but results speak for themselves." He gestured to oil paintings covering the walls, portraits of Ashford ancestors dating back generations. Each face shared the same cold, calculating expression, as if warmth and human feeling had been bred out of the family line entirely. "My great-great-grandfather began with nothing," Cornelius continued, "just ambition and the wisdom to understand that fortune favors those willing to make difficult choices by difficult choices." Thomas wasn't sure he wanted to know what the man meant. "The tobacco market is competitive." Cornelius went on. "Labor costs can destroy a plantation's profitability if not managed properly. We have found innovative solutions to such problems. Thomas's mouth went dry as understanding began to dawn. The graves in the forest, the whispers pleading for remembrance, the systematic horror hidden beneath Ashford prosperity. "You kill your own slaves," he whispered. Cornelius raised an eyebrow. "Such an ugly word. We prefer to think of it as natural wastage. Slaves die." Mr. Whitmore, disease, accident, overwork. The wise planter simply ensures their deaths serve a purpose. He turned the ledger so Thomas could see the page's neat columns, recorded names, dates, and causes of death, but there were far too many entries. Hundreds of deaths over the years, all carefully documented like entries in a business account. Some we work until their hearts give out. Cornelius explained with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Others become examples when discipline is required. A few serve special purposes. Catherine moved to stand beside her brother, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. "The truly innovative aspect," she said, "is how we dispose of the bodies. Most planters have slave cemeteries, visible reminders of their losses. We have found that unmarked graves serve multiple purposes." Thomas felt sick, but forced himself to keep listening. What purposes? Unmarked graves cannot be counted by abolitionists or government inspectors. Cornelius said, "They cannot become rallying points for other slaves, and they can be reused as needed." Used. Catherine smiled her predator's smile. "The forest soil is very rich. Mr. Whitmore, excellent. For growing things, bodies decompose quickly in Virginia's humid climate. Within a few years, a grave can accommodate a new occupant." Thomas thought of the 91 graves he had counted and realized with growing horror that the actual death toll must be far higher. How many people had died on this plantation? How many bodies had been buried and reburied in that hidden cemetery? The business model is quite elegant. Cornelius continued, "We purchase slaves, work them to death, bury them in unmarked graves, and purchase replacements. The cost per unit of labor remains constant while productivity increases. No other plantation in Virginia can match our profit margins." But Thomas realized there was something even worse than the systematic murder. The victims weren't just forgotten. They were being deliberately erased from history. No records of their births, their lives, their deaths. No headstones to mark their existence as far as the world knew. These people had simply vanished. Catherine must have seen something in his expression because her smile widened. "You begin to understand," she said. "The true innovation isn't just in killing them, it's in making them disappear completely, as if they never existed at all." Cornelius closed the ledger with a satisfied snap, which brings us to a small problem. "Mr. Whitmore, your surveying work threatens our little arrangement. Maps are public records. If the Commonwealth knows about the forest cemetery, questions might be asked." Thomas's throat felt like sandpaper. "Could modify the survey leave that area?" Unmapped, both siblings laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore," Catherine said, "you still don't understand. The problem isn't what you might report. The problem is what you already know, and dead men tell no tales." Thomas turned to run, but found his legs wouldn't obey him. The tea from yesterday, they had drugged him again somehow. As paralysis crept up his body, Cornelius stood and walked around the desk. "Don't worry," he said. "Your death will serve a purpose. One more grave in our hidden cemetery. One more forgotten soul feeding our fortune." But as Thomas collapsed to the floor, he saw something that gave him hope. Through the study window, he glimpsed Patience watching from the garden, and in her hand she held something that glinted in the fading light. His surveying journal, the one he had left in his room that morning. Thomas awoke in absolute darkness. His wrists were bound, and he lay on rough wooden planks that reeked of death and decay. The air was thick, with the smell of lime and something far worse. As his eyes adjusted, he realized he was in some kind of underground chamber. Stone walls curved overhead, and the floor was littered with bones, human bones. The Ashfords had built their own private charnel. House panic flooded through him as he tested his bonds. The ropes were tight, but not impossibly so. If he could work at them quietly, he might be able to free himself. But free himself to what? Even if he escaped this underground tomb, he was still trapped on the Ashford plantation with nowhere to run. A soft scuffling sound made him freeze. Something moved in the darkness beyond his vision. footsteps approaching slow and deliberate. Thomas held his breath, expecting to see Cornelius or Catherine coming to finish what they had started. Instead, a small figure emerged from the shadows. Patience knelt beside him, her fingers working quickly at the ropes around his wrists. "Hush," she whispered. "They think you're unconscious for hours yet, but we don't have much time." Her touch was gentle but urgent as she freed his hands. Thomas sat up, slowly fighting waves of nausea from whatever drug they had given him. "Why are you helping me?" Patience's young face was streaked with tears. "Because someone has to remember. Someone has to tell the world what they'd done here." She pulled his surveying journal from beneath her worn apron. "I can't read much, but I seen the numbers. 91 graves you wrote down, but that ain't all of them." Thomas stared at her. "What do you mean?" "There's more cemeteries," she whispered. 3. More hidden in different parts of the plantation. Been filling them for 50 years now. Maybe longer. My grandmother told me stories before she died. Said the first Ashfords killed Indians lived here before, buried them in the woods and planted tobacco over their bones. The scope of the horror was staggering. How many people had died to build the Ashford fortune? How many lives had been sacrificed for profit? How many souls had been erased from history? Patience helped him to his feet. "There's a way out through the old wine cellar tunnel that leads to the river, but you gotta take something with you, proof of what they done." She led him through a maze of underground passages. The Ashford house sat on top of a network of cellars and tunnels, some dating back over a century. Along the way, Patience showed him rooms filled with evidence of systematic murder ledgers recording the deaths of hundreds of slaves, tools, and chains used for torture. Rooms where bodies had been dismembered to fit in smaller graves. Most horrifying of all was what Patience called the breeding room, where female slaves had been forced to produce children who were killed as infants. Their tiny bodies used to fill gaps in adult graves. "We tried to rebel once," she whispered, as they climbed toward ground level. "Back when I was just a child, 23 of us planned to run away together. The Ashfords found out, made examples of every single one, buried them alive in the forest cemetery, while the rest of us watched. Since then, nobody tries to run, too scared, too broken. But you can escape. You can tell people what really happened here." They emerged through a hidden door in the wine cellar. Above them, Thomas could hear voices, Cornelius and Catherine discussing his body's disposal. Soon they would discover his absence. Patience pressed a heavy canvas bag into his hands. "Copies of the ledgers," she said. "Maps of all the hidden cemeteries. Names of some of the victims. Everything I could gather over the years." Thomas looked at this young woman who had risked everything to help him. "Come with me," she shook her head sadly. "They'd hunt me down, kill everyone I ever spoke to. But you can get this to people who matter, government men, newspaper writers, people who can make them pay." Through the cellar windows came the sound of running feet, shouts of anger, as the Ashfords discovered his escape. "Hurry," Patience urged. "The tunnels behind those wine barrels follows the old creek bed to the river. There's a boat hidden in the reeds." Thomas hesitated, torn between escape and the knowledge that he was abandoning dozens of people to continue suffering. Patience seemed to read his thoughts. "We've been dead for years already," she said. "Ain't nothing you can do to save us now, but you can make sure the world remembers. Make sure our lives meant something." The shouts were getting closer. Thomas squeezed her hand, then slipped into the tunnel. Behind him, he heard Patience moving barrels to hide the entrance. The tunnel was barely wide enough for his shoulders and pitch black. Thomas crawled through mud and roots, guided only by the faint movement of air that suggested an opening ahead. The sound of pursuit faded behind him, but he knew the Ashfords wouldn't give up easily. They had too much to lose. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened onto the riverbank. Just as Patience had promised, a small rowboat was hidden among the tall reeds. Thomas pushed off into the current, clutching the bag of evidence. As the Ashford plantation disappeared behind him, he made a silent promise to the spirits that haunted that cursed ground. Their names would be remembered. Their stories would be told. The Ashford fortune would not be built on forgotten graves any longer. Richmond, Virginia buzzed with pre-war tensions in the winter of 1858. Thomas Whitmore sat in the offices of the Richmond Inquirer, surrounded by papers that would shake the Commonwealth to its foundations. Editor James Morrison read through the evidence with growing horror. "This is monstrous," he whispered. "If even half of this is true, it's all true." Thomas said he saw the graves. "I have the ledgers. I barely escaped with my life." Morrison was a veteran journalist who had covered political scandals and criminal trials, but the scope of the Ashford atrocities left him visibly shaken. 437 documented deaths, he said, reading from the copied ledgers. "And you believe there were more?" Thomas nodded grimly. "The girl who helped me escape said they've been doing this for generations. Her grandmother remembered Indian killings from the 1790s. We're not just talking about murdered slaves. We're talking about genocide." The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed records of systematic killing maps showing the locations of hidden mass graves. Even sketches Thomas had made of the underground chambers and torture devices. But Morrison raised a troubling point. The Ashfords are one of Virginia's most prominent families. Cornelius sits on the governor's council. Catherine is engaged to Senator Randolph's son. Powerful people will want this buried. Thomas had expected resistance. The plantation system depended on the fiction that slavery was benevolent. Evidence of systematic murder would undermine the entire economic structure of the South. But he hadn't anticipated how quickly the Ashfords would strike. Back within days of Morrison agreeing to publish the story, strange things began happening. A fire destroyed Thomas's boarding house, though he wasn't injured. His surveying equipment was stolen from a locked warehouse. Most disturbing of all, he began receiving visitors at odd hours, men in expensive suits who claimed to represent various business interests. They offered him money positions in other states, anything to make him reconsider his accusations against the Ashford family when bribes failed. The threats began, notes left under his door, strangers following him through Richmond's streets, a dead rat nailed to his office door with a message. Some secrets should stay buried, but Thomas had made a promise to the dead. He would not be intimidated into silence. Morrison published the first article on February 14, 1859. The headline read, "Horror at Ashford Grove. Evidence suggests systematic murder of over 400 slaves." The reaction was explosive. Abolitionists seized on the story as proof of slavery's ultimate evil. Pro-slavery politicians denounced it as Northern propaganda. The Ashford family issued a statement calling the accusations vicious lies spread by enemies of Virginia, but Thomas had anticipated their denials. Working with Morrison and a team of investigators, they had gathered even more evidence, testimony from former overseers who had worked at other plantations, financial records showing impossible profit margins at Ashford Grove. Most damning of all, interviews with escaped slaves who had heard stories about the hidden graves. The second article ran a week later with the headline, "The Ashford Ledgers: How a Virginia Dynasty Built Its Fortune on Mass Murder." This time, the evidence was impossible to dismiss. Actual pages from Cornelius Ashford's business records, photographs of the surveying maps Thomas had created, detailed descriptions of the underground chambers and their contents. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. Even some slavery supporters expressed horror at the systematic nature of the killings. Governor Henry Wise announced a formal investigation. Federal marshals were dispatched to Ashford Grove. But when they arrived, they found the plantation abandoned. The main house had been stripped of furniture and documents. The hidden cemeteries Thomas had mapped were empty. Every grave had been dug up and the contents removed. Even the underground chambers had been cleared of evidence. The Ashfords had vanished completely, taking their secrets with them. Initial investigations suggested they had fled to Europe, but Thomas suspected the truth was more complex. A family that had spent decades perfecting the art of making people disappear wouldn't leave loose ends. 3 months after the first article appeared, Thomas received a visitor at his hotel, a young black woman who looked familiar, though he couldn't place her. She spoke in whispers as if afraid of being overheard. "You remember me," she said. "Patience." From the plantation, Thomas stared in shock. "You escaped. How did you find me?" She smiled sadly. "I've been following the newspaper stories. Wanted to thank you for keeping your promise. Our names are being remembered now." But I also came to warn you. The Ashfords didn't run away like everyone thinks. They're still here still. Killing still burying the truth. Thomas felt ice in his veins. What do you mean? Patience pulled a folded newspaper from her bag. The obituary section was marked in pencil. 4 deaths in the past month. She said, all people who worked on the investigation, official. Causes were accidents or natural deaths, but I recognized the pattern, the same way people used to die at the plantation. Thomas read the marked obituaries with growing dread. A journalist who had interviewed escaped slaves, a federal marshal who had examined the empty graves, a photographer who had documented the underground chambers, a clerk who had copied financial records, all dead within weeks of each other, all deaths perfectly explainable if viewed individually, but together they formed an undeniable pattern. The Ashfords were eliminating witnesses, and Thomas was next on their list. The letter arrived on a cold March morning in 1859 cream-colored paper, with the Ashford family seal pressed into red. Wax Thomas recognized Catherine's elegant handwriting. Immediately, dear Mr. Whitmore, you have caused us considerable inconvenience with your wild accusations and forged documents. We believe it is time for a final conversation. If you value the lives of your sister's children in Baltimore, you will come alone to the old Westover church at midnight tonight. Come armed if you wish, it will make no difference. Regards, Catherine Ashford. Thomas's hand shook as he read the threat his sister Martha had written just last week about her twins starting school. The Ashfords had found his only weakness. He spent the day making preparations. Letters to Morrison and others revealing everything he suspected about the continuing murders. Maps of all the hidden cemeteries. Copies of every piece of evidence. If he didn't survive the night, the truth would still come. To light Westover Church sat on a bluff overlooking the James River built in the 1730s. It had been abandoned for decades, after the congregation moved to a newer building in town. Thomas arrived at 11:30 and found the ancient cemetery empty, except for weathered headstones. The church itself was dark, but he could see light flickering through the broken windows, candlelight dancing across the walls like spirits. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, Catherine waited alone at the altar, wore a black dress that made her pale skin seem luminous in the candlelight. Her ice-blue eyes reflected the flames like mirrors. "Welcome, Thomas," she said without turning around. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." "Where's your brother?" Catherine smiled that cold predatory smile. "Cornelius is attending to other business. Your sister has such lovely children. It would be tragic if something happened to them." Thomas felt rage building in his chest. "You're finished. The whole world knows what you've done. The government will hunt you down no matter where you run." Catherine laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Oh, Thomas, you still don't understand. We never intended to run. This was always part of the plan." She turned to face him, and Thomas saw that her eyes had changed. The blue was darker now, almost black, and in their depths something moved, something that wasn't human. "You see," she continued, her voice echoing strangely in the empty church, "the Ashford fortune was never built on tobacco or cotton. Those were just the cover. The real source of our power is much older, much darker." She gestured to the walls where Thomas now noticed dozens of symbols carved into the wooden panels. Not Christian crosses, but something far more ancient, symbols that hurt to look at directly. "My great-great-grandfather didn't just kill the Indians who lived on our land," she said. "He made a bargain with what they worshipped, something that had been sleeping beneath the Virginia soil for thousands of years, something that fed on death and despair." Thomas tried to back toward the door, but found his feet wouldn't obey. The same paralysis that had taken him in the Ashford study. "Every soul that dies on our land makes it stronger." Catherine continued, "Every unmarked grave feeds its hunger, and in return it gives us wealth beyond measure, power beyond imagination, life beyond death." As she spoke, Thomas realized the terrible truth. The Ashfords weren't just murderers. They were servants of something inhuman, something that viewed human life as nothing more than food. The systematic killing, the hidden graves, the careful erasure of victims from history. It was all feeding this ancient evil, all strengthening its hold on the world. Catherine began to change before his eyes. Her pale skin became translucent, revealing dark veins beneath her fingers elongated into claws. Her smile widened to show rows of needle-sharp teeth. "You helped us more than you know," she said in a voice like grinding stone. "Every newspaper article, every investigation, every person who came looking for evidence, all of them disappeared. All of them joined our collection of forgotten souls." Thomas understood with sickening clarity. The government officials, the journalists, even patients, all of them had been killed. All of them, buried in new hidden graves. His investigation hadn't exposed the Ashford crimes. It had simply provided more victims, more souls to feed the thing beneath Virginia soil. But Thomas had one final card to play. With his last ounce of strength, he pulled out a small glass vial holy water from St. Paul's Church in Richmond. He had prepared for the possibility that he was facing something supernatural. Catherine hissed and recoiled as he threw the contents at her. Where the blessed water touched her skin, it burned like acid, but instead of destroying her, it seemed to awaken something even worse. The thing wearing Catherine's face began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass and screaming. "Wind, foolish man, did you think we were demons, devils to be banished with your Christian trinkets? We are older than your God, stronger than your prayers. We are the hunger that lives in the earth itself, the need that turns men into monsters, the darkness that makes civilization possible." Thomas felt his strength failing, but as consciousness faded, he heard something that gave him hope. Voices, hundreds of voices, all the forgotten dead rising to speak. The holy water hadn't destroyed the entity, but it had awakened the souls it had consumed. Every victim of Ashford greed, every murdered slave, every erased life. They surrounded Catherine now, not as vengeful ghosts but as witnesses. Their voices joined in testimony, speaking names that had been forgotten, telling stories that had been buried, demanding justice that had been denied. Thomas died that night in Westover Church, but the dead who surrounded him in his final moments made sure his sacrifice wasn't meaningless. They spoke through the living, whispered to investigators, guided searchers to hidden evidence, led authorities to the real graves, the real truth. 6 months later, the Virginia General Assembly passed emergency legislation, requiring detailed records of all slave deaths, mandating regular inspections of plantation cemeteries, establishing penalties for systematic abuse. The Ashford name was struck from all public records, their properties seized and sold, their bloodline cursed and forgotten. But those who worked on the case knew the real victory wasn't legal. It was spiritual. 437 names had been restored to history. 437 souls had found their voices again. The entity beneath the Virginia soil still hungers, still whispers to those willing to trade lives for profit. But the dead remember now, and the dead never forget. They watch from unmarked graves. They speak through rustling leaves. They ensure that no victim stays forgotten forever. In the end, Thomas Whitmore's surveying was complete. He had mapped not just the boundaries of the Ashford plantation, but the geography of evil itself, and marked it clearly for all to see. The end.